Thank you once all again for joining us, and let's dive into our introductory roundtable with our special guests. So today we are going to start with a short presentation from Christine Wong Yap. Christine Wong Yap, she, they, is a visual artist and social practitioner specializing in hyper-local participatory research projects, which gather and amplify grassroots perspectives on belonging, resilience, and mental well-being. So Christine, I'm going to pin you now, and you are welcome to go ahead and get us started.
All right. I hope everybody can see my screen. Thanks to everyone for being here on this very windy and rainy atmospheric river night. And yeah, thank you for your attention. I know in my bio, there's a bunch of different jargon words, but I'm going to share some images that I hope will give you a sense of what I do. Although first I have to do some more words in my first 3 slides. So to answer the question, how can we redesign spaces for belonging? I want to talk about a specific project. So one way we could redesign spaces for belonging is to build bridges across languages, cultures, and neighborhoods through art and social practice projects, which utilize community building, storytelling, art making, and language justice. Social practice is a little bit of a jargony term, but if I were going to use some of the language out of David Jay's amazing book, Relationality, I would say that I make relational containers. So I want to frame a little bit about bridging through the work of the Othering and Belonging Institute, or OBI, at UC Berkeley. So what do we mean by bridging? And OBI describes it as involving 2 or more groups coming together across acknowledged lines of difference in a way that both affirms their distinct identities and creates a new, more expansive identity. And why do we want to bridge? It's because it's one of the major ways of promoting belonging, according to John A. Powell, the director of OBI. So I thought I would root us in places which are not too far from the Mechanics Institute, Chinatown and the Mission District in San Francisco. So Chinatown is a space of belonging for many Chinese-speaking immigrants due to the access that it affords to language, culture, services, and a shrinking but protected amount of affordable housing. And the Mission District is a similar space of belonging for many Spanish-speaking immigrants for the same reasons. So I created a project called Como Sigo Morando Arriba, or Yang, which is a trilingual project in which I brought together a cohort of 16 working class immigrant women who have limited access to the arts and limited English proficiency. And I brought them together for a paid opportunity with childcare and transportation support. About half of the women are Chinese from Chinatown and immigrated within the past 5 years, and the other half are Spanish speakers from the Mission District. In the project, we held 6 trilingual language justice informed workshops involving community building, positive psychology, and cross-cultural bridging. The first 3 workshops were in Chinatown, where designers shared their immigration stories and learned about research on resilience and principles of visual design. And I worked with them to design banners to represent their power and resilience. And we held the last 3 workshops in the Mission District, which is only 2.5 miles from Chinatown. But our workshops were the first time that some of the Latino women visited Chinatown, and vice versa of the Chinese women visiting the Mission District. So in the last 2 workshops at the Mission District, the designers learned hands-on fabrication skills to create their banners and textiles, which we then marched in the 2023 Chinese New Year Parade, accompanied by their friends and family and a mariachi band. Our contingent was the first contemporary art project in the Chinese New Year Parade, which is the largest of its kind outside of China, and it actually dates back to the 1850s. And I just like to think about how the Chinese New Year parade itself is an event where a lot of people, whether they're Chinese or not, whether they're locals or visitors, they feel welcome to celebrate Chinese culture, which is kind of special here, and especially in an era of resurgent xenophobia. So I'm grateful to the parade organizers for allowing us to kind of broaden this is traditionally monocultural event with a demonstration of cross-cultural solidarity. If you want to learn more, there's a lot more on my website, and the women's stories, their rationales for creating the designs are pretty powerful. So you can find that at the website there. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
And thank you so much for showing that presentation, Christine. We will now move into Brooke's presentation. Brooke, you want to go ahead?
Yes, thank you so much. Let me share. That was amazing, Christine. Thank you so much. I'm a huge fan of Christine's work. So I'm so happy to be here with all of you. I'm Brooke Toczylowski, as well as with these other panelists whose work I deeply admire and have learned so much from. I straddle both education and the art world, which are really quite distinct. So I'm going to first talk about my experience within K-12 public schools, and then discuss how I'm investigating belonging within my art practice briefly. First off, I love teachers, and good teachers are really impressive designers. They engage the design thinking cycle more than anyone I know, reflecting on how a lesson went and then redesigning for the next day, often engaging hundreds of kids. Like, they get real-time feedback on a rapid prototype and then they do it again. Let me go to the next slide here. I've been in hundreds of public school classrooms as a longtime teaching artist and a classroom teacher, and then later as a teacher coach and a founder and leader in Agency by Design Oakland, there in the Bay Area, which was part of a research project, which this book really dives into, seeking to integrate maker-centered learning into teachers' practices. A good teacher is skilled at turning the classroom into what David calls, and which Christine mentioned, this relational container. So this is incredibly important. Strong relationships between adults and the students' families in the classroom are really this critical mycelial linkage that allows you to meet the students' needs. And in a school with weak relationships, where students don't feel a sense of belonging, or even worse, where oppressive harm is consistent and goes unrepaired, students are less likely to learn. And if you're more interested in learning about some of the brain research, which confirms this, I recommend this book. In order to build new dendrites and connections in the brain, students need to feel safe and they need to be able to trust others. And that's why belonging is so critical to our classrooms, and why we need it so that young people can reach their potential. All the tools in Susie's book, Designed for Belonging, are applicable to the classroom as well as to teacher professional development or any learning environment. And in addition to these, let's see if I get to the next slide, the core belonging tool that I've been committed to in my educational career has been art and making, hands-on learning, project-based learning, where students are given an opportunity to make sense of the content, to express their own voice, to collectively participate in meaning making. One of the reasons Christine's artwork is so powerful is because it's participatory and it disrupts the often one-directional experience that we have in galleries and museums. The method itself cultivates belonging, and that's more of what we need in the classroom. So then, switching hats, moving over to my art practice. Since moving from Oakland to, I now live in Central Connecticut, which I moved and I did during the pandemic. I've gone back to school to get my MFA, which I'm finishing up now. And my current practice examines historical and ecological relationships to land. So belonging has inevitably become a core thread in my work. And relations with others are very present. I collaborate with botanical ink I've made from my community dye garden. I print with materials I've collected from the sites I'm investigating, and I invite other people and methodologies into my research with me. I am curious about the word belonging. We can develop a feeling of being connected to one another, but belonging is also a noun for possession. It communicates ownership. this phone belongs to me, or I belong to the co-op, or these are my belongings. These statements draw a line, a boundary. And historically, when we look at land deeds and wills in colonial America in the 17th and 18th century, the word belonging is used to describe these objects of ownership, including human beings. Therefore, embedded in the word belonging, there is also othering. Colonialism, slavery, capitalism, and on. These are human design systems that have cut us off from one another and from the land. But as Ramad Wall Kimmerer says, I got her new book today, The Service Berry. It came in the mail. Highly recommend all of her books. She says, the land knows you, even when you're lost. And so I know that the earth, which we are the belongings of, and not vice versa, plays for me a critical role in this conversation. My most recent social practice, I'm very much a virgin artist, just getting my feet wet in all of this regard, graduating with my MFA. But over the course of 6 months, I've collaborated with the public and collaborators to gather in my community garden plot and discuss belonging from multiple perspectives. So, for example, working with the Institute for American Indian Studies, talking about storytelling and land acknowledgements, or ecological belonging of plant species with a local biologist, and then most recently through a public performance with a wooden picket fence, which is a symbol and a tool of land dispossession here in colonial New England, which is where I'm based. So I've tried to cultivate discussion and push the possibility space around borders and belonging. Thank you so much.
What a beautiful presentation, Brooke. Thank you for that. And now we will transition into David J. And David, would you like to share your answer to the question, how might we redesign spaces for belonging?
Yes, thank you so much. David J, he, him pronouns. I apologize, I do not have beautiful visuals for you. I come to you, unfortunately, not as an artist and designer. I come from sort of the intersection of technology and social movements. My background is building spaces for people like me who identify as asexual online. Though now I organize tech workers inside of social media companies. And I also, as part of a two-parent family, do a lot of work around inviting people into communities of care, which are a way of thinking about belonging that resonates deeply with me. Most of my work deals not with how we design spaces for belonging, but why we so often fail to resource and fund the spaces that already exist. What I believe is we don't lack the wisdom about how to do this. We lack the appreciation and the resourcing that's needed. And so a lot of my work is trying to do that, but I want to share some of the journey I've been on to understand for myself what belonging is, what the phrase that the two previous presenters used, relational containers, what those are and how we can build them. And so a big part of my journey has been wanting to understand what a relationship is. If I want to be able to build relationship in my life, if I want to be able to help people know, like, oh, if you're putting money towards building a relationship, you want to know that it's happening. You want to be able to validate success. It's helpful to be able to have a clear sense of what a definition of what a relationship is. And this is a gap. If you look at Wikipedia, the word relationship is a disintermediation page. And so a definition that I really like is that a relationship exists when we change one another. And the more deeply and powerfully we change one another, the more powerful that relationship is. This is inspired by Octavia Butler and Parable of Sower, which is behind me here. And so a relational container, therefore, is this place where we engage in the really vulnerable work of learning to change one another, experimenting with different ways of changing and being changed to find something that brings resilience and transformation to our life. And a key part of relational containers is that they do not work like factories. A factory, the more successful it is, the more predictable it becomes. But when you build a relational container, if we succeed at creating a relationship, the more successful we are, the less predictable the outcome is. The more successful we are at creating the conditions for a great conversation, the less we know where the conversation is going to go. And that is an unavoidable part of building a relationship, which I think in some ways messes with the way we used to thinking about design, and also very much messes with the way that we used to thinking about funding. that intrinsic, beautiful unpredictability. And so when I think about designing for belonging, I think about, I seek inspiration from, to echo what you were saying, Brooke, from a few places, but I want to start by talking about the more than human world. Not just because I found that to be such a vital part of my own relational practice. If I want to connect with people, being in nature is an incredible way to do that. If I want to connect with myself, learning wisdom from nature is an incredible way to do that. And one part of that for me has been looking at the natural world and the really incredible ways that relationships make it up and the ways that it creates relationship. And one concept that has proven really powerful to me comes from ecology, and it's this idea of evolutionary rate. And ecologists started looking out into the world, and they realized that some ecosystems seem to be better at generating new and interesting stuff, better at generating new relationships than others. If you compare a coral reef to the open ocean, you compare a set of tide pools to a flat beach, you compare the edge zone between the grassland and the forest to either the grassland or the forest. You're going to get more biodiversity, you're going to get more biomass, you're going to get what's called a higher evolutionary rate. New and interesting things are happening more. And so one was I was looking at these and in the sort of researching the dynamics of relational systems, some of the work that I do, there's a deep parallel between the process of evolution, how we learn to change one another, and how we learn to change one another, how we learn to be in relationship. So three quick sources of inspiration I'll take in designing for belonging, and these echo, Susie, I think your book beautifully. The first is fractal geometry. High evolutionary rate often has a lot of tiny niches where things can kind of like do their own thing and then pop out and interact with one another, like a coral reef, like the rainforest canopy, like a tide pool. The other is edge zones, places that sit between two places, two diverse places, where those places come and interact, tend to have a higher evolutionary rate than places that are homogeneous. And the last is cycles, places where there is a cyclical process. So if you think about sort of bamboo that seeds only every few years, there's a process of a lot of abundance followed by like a lot of activity followed by rest that is coordinated across the ecosystem. That tends to lead to relationship. And I see this in many communities, faith communities, where they'll have major holidays and they'll have minor holidays and they'll have weekly services. That kind of a pattern is often indicative of a predictor of high evolutionary rate, and I believe a predictor of a strong relational container. There's also a few tools I take from my movement history, the power of onboarding and personal story. If there's a space where people know how to reveal, like there's a story that they tell about themselves that they can uniquely tell in that community. And when they join the community, they're taught to tell that unique story. That is a powerful way to drive connection. After spaces, if often the magic happens after an event ends, when there's a snack table, when there's drinks, when there's a dance floor. So creating those after spaces and really looking to them to be the places where deep connections happen, as opposed to sort of the places that we structure, is a powerful thing. And then the last thing I want to speak to very, very deeply, because it's been so critical in my work, is the power of lineage. I think a lot about my grandma. I think about the trans elders that taught me as a young queer activist, and how when we design for relationship, the things that we invent, the things we come up with, are often not the most powerful tools. The most powerful tools are the things that are being tested and refined for decades, the things that our elders, including our more than human elders, give us. And so when I think about how to design for relationship, I often think about what are lineages, what are practices that have worked for decades or centuries that I can draw from, that my ancestors have given me. How do I use those as my foundation rather than wanting to invent from scratch? So I'll leave things there.
Thank you so much for sharing all those beautiful schemas that arise from your practice, David. We're going to now move into Susie's presentation. Susie, you want to get us started?
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm just loving hearing all of this too. I kind of don't want to add mine to it, but I will, just because I also do like kind of multiplicities and the pluriverse. So here is just a few slides to share about my practice of designing for belonging. One of the things to say about this is that I often really like to start by asking the question, can you design for belonging? And I answer yes and no. You can't design belonging. We all experience that, however we're going to experience it in whatever context we are in. What we can do is design for belonging to emerge. And I really think of this as the work of collective action, and wanted to call out also, I'm just loving being with the artist that worked on my book, whose name is Rose Jaffe, and she's a mural artist. And if you got the book, there are these fold-outs of the host heroes and of the moments of belonging and the tools of belonging, that are these beautiful fold-outs, partially because she's a mural artist. It really worked. The framework that I work with is around feeling, seeing, and shaping belonging. And so here's the first of a piece, second, I guess, from Rose. Really important to notice when and where and how do you feel belonging as an individual, and then also to inquire of others across difference, across all different kinds of identities. When and where does belonging emerge, and what does it feel like? Really investigating that is part of it. Sometimes when we start to think of it, what we actually come up with are times when we didn't feel like we belonged. And this is a photograph of me at a time when I felt like I didn't belong, which was my mother's second wedding. And as I started doing this work, I was mining my own stories of times of belonging and not. And I think that's really can be really fruitful to both mine your own stories and be in conversation with others about when and where belonging is emerging for them. Once we know some of that, then we can start to name some particular moments that matter. And in the book, I name these 9 moments: the invitation, entering, participating, code switching, contributing, flowing, dissenting, repairing, and the exiting. And these are not the only moments that matter for belonging, but they are some that particularly do. And I also am often inviting people to think about when they dig into when and where they feel belonging, to name it as a kind of moment. Because that design thrives in specificity, so really naming something can be helpful. And then once we understand a particular moment that we want to work on, that we want to reimagine, that we think might be a site where new experiences could emerge, then some of my work is about inviting people to expand what we think we can design. Certainly in kind of work culture, the answer is often, an email or a meeting. But remembering that space and role and ritual, events, groupings, communications, these are all things that we can actually design and redesign to bring about more belonging. And part of my work from a design perspective is to invite us to really take a prototyping mindset. So trying things out and seeing, did more people have a stronger sense of belonging, or did they not when I crafted a new event, for instance? So that's the work for me, is building tools around feeling belonging so that we can see it and then do the work of design to shape it. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for sharing that presentation, Susie. It is almost 6:30, and so I'm going to try my best to start to integrate some of the existing questions in our text box into the questions that I have prepared. And so let's talk about the dynamics of belonging and othering. And let me make sure that everyone is pinned for this part of our roundtable. There we go. Okay. All right. So, Belonging and othering often exist in tension. How does your work engage with this dynamic, and how do you use design as a tool to actively shift the balance towards belonging as an ongoing process? And I want to integrate that with Rob's question, which is for any of the panelists, often design is a political issue, right? What approach do you use or recommend for reaching people who tend to have a knee-jerk negative reaction sensitivity on design? For example, they might feel overwhelmed by the material or put off by the subliminal suggestion of art in design. And he also adds, I hope that that makes sense. So we'll start with Susie on those sort of two integrated questions.
Okay, I'll give it a try. I'm going to share again just one image of a tool that I really like to use. This is an emotional journey map, and it's a very simple tool that's used a lot in design, participatory design, co-design processes to have conversations with folks, and really then to very simply like identify when and where is a place of belonging and when is it feeling like not belonging, which might not be as extreme as explicit othering, but is the kind of the inverse there. And so I think that using these very kind of basic tools to have very human conversations is a way to embrace the tensions of belonging and othering. And also, to your question, I think is a way to kind of demystify design. That what we are actually trying to do when we're doing design is to come up with ways to be better together. So that's kind of my take. I would love to hear what others are thinking about.
Can I jump in? I have something I wanted to share. This is basically a kind of like set of community norms that I share when I lead workshops. So it's just guiding principles that are based on growth mindset, which is a body of research developed by Carol Dweck, which I think many educators are very familiar with. And it's just encouraging a spirit of experimentation and trying, and discouraging all the things that I think you would find in like a regular art school or design school critique setting: judgment, comparison, criticism, and perfectionism. So I think just setting the tone there, where it's a dialogue and an experiment, is a great place to start. I will say, just as far as like, how does your work engage the dynamic of belonging and othering, is that an important part of what I do as a social practitioner is design the overall project. And for an artist, I can say, oh, I'm going to use this media and work on this scale and use these images. Those are the ingredients that I have to play with in my toolbox. As a social practitioner, who I'm engaging, on what terms, what's being exchanged, is it mutual, is it extractive? Those are the things in my toolbox that I get to play with. So working with low-income women, women who are specifically women who are immigrants or newcomers, maybe they're undocumented, and if they have limited English proficiency, those are very intentional choices. And I do want to just address, there was a question about whether language justice, it kind of touches on the idea of language justice versus language access. So for a long time, I was just interested in language access. I was the primary caregiver for my mom, who was elderly and spoke other languages, not English, Chinese, and then she also learned some Spanish when she migrated through the Dominican Republic. She learned some Vietnamese when she was living in Vietnam and was a survivor of the Vietnam War. But you know, she worked really hard all her life, raising me and supporting her husband and studying English, but not to the extent where she could help me apply to college or express to her doctor exactly what's hurting and where. So yeah, I think it is important to have resources to support people if they choose to study English, but I also think it's important to meet people where they're at, which I think is an important design principle. And I think it touches upon the idea of humility that Susie has written about, intellectual and cultural humility. And I think there's something there about language justice in not assuming that English is the thing that other people have to come to. Because when I get in front of a workshop situation and I practice my terrible Spanish, it's a humbling experience for me. And I think that allows people to also take risks and try in their art and design process.
It seems like we are ready to move on to our next question for our roundtable. So we're going to move into the topic of belonging as a verb. So if we understand belonging as a verb, an action rather than a state, how does this perspective influence the way you approach relationships, spaces, or communities in your creative practice? And I'm going to start with David on this question.
I think about belonging as a verb, as about this really, I think, to me, sacred work of creating places for relationship. So a thing that we have as humans, I think a powerful, unique ability to do is to look out into the world, see the relationships that don't exist but are possible, and then create the environments where those relationships happen. Whether that is a dinner party with our friends, a conversation where we create the space for a conflict to play out in a healthy way. And so when I think about the belonging as a verb, it is this way of looking out into the world, seeing what relationships are possible, seeing that person who's just walked into a new community who needs to be personally seen and welcomed, and kind of recognizing that and recognize that there's an opportunity to show up to that person, and knowing both in our minds and our bodies how we show up to that person. That way of sort of seeing and moving in the relational world so that we can invite more and more integrated relationship into being. I think that to me is the work of belonging, the work of what I sometimes think of as relational practice. And I think it shows up in the ways that we design, but it also shows up really deeply in just the ways that we are present with those around us.
I think that complements beautifully with a private question that Tess offered, which is actually Kelly offered, which is, what does belonging look like? Can we identify it for others, or do people need to tell us when they feel it? Does anybody want to maybe jump in and add any notes in addition to what David has said?
I can jump in a little bit. To say that I do think that belonging is importantly, self-identified, that people identify belonging in lots of different ways, that can have community layers also. But I do think it's very difficult to prescribe belonging. And remembering too that we know that it is such a fundamental need that humans have. And part of the kind of the verb piece for me is most of those moments of belonging that I like to call out are verbs too. And that comes from conversations that I had in multiple contexts with folks describing those times when they've felt belonging. And it emerges that it was a time when they felt like they were contributing to something, for instance, and that identifying that those kind of other verbs that are part of belonging becomes really interesting, because then you can notice that helps belonging, and you can design then, oh, if that's going to be helpful, what are all the different ways? And to this question about schools and school closures, like when you're designing a new context for people to join in, what are the mechanisms where you're going to let people contribute? And that can be very simple things of telling a story or bringing a photograph or contributing to a mural, right? But the small acts of contribution can be very agentic in terms of building belonging.
I wanted to step in just very quickly on this question of how we know, as someone who does a lot of work around relational measurement and impact assessment, which is that when we change one another, when we're in a relationship, yes, we need to ask people, but to your point, there are certain behaviors that emerge when relationship happens. And when I'm looking for evidence of relationship, I look for connection, care, creativity, and generative conflict. So, do people who connect through the community spend time together of their own accord? Do they support one another in ways that they're not asked to? Do they create things together that are innovative and a reflection of the community's values? And finally, when they engage in conflict, do they engage in conflict in ways that are generative, that result in the community feeling more aligned with its values and trusting one another? Those are all, I think, to me, powerful indicators that belonging is happening, that can complement asking people directly about it.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That kind of perfectly segues us to our next part of our roundtable. The theme will be designing for connection. I want to first read a question actually from Eileen Marinan. She says, a big divisive issue in Oakland is the closure and merging of schools. People oppose it because they lose their neighborhood school and their children are sent farther away for their education. Has any of you thought about, worked on issues like these and how they can be addressed to help the children and parents adjust to and thrive in their new environment? And, Brooke is a lifelong learner and teacher, and that kind of complements the question. In your experience, what does it take to design spaces or systems that move beyond static inclusion and into fostering active relational belonging? Brooke, do you want to take us away?
Sure, thank you, Nico. I think a lot of people have mentioned verbs, and certainly I definitely want to emphasize that this idea of, active belonging takes actions, right? Like building, planting, tending, drawing, doing. And as sort of a curricular specialist, that's what I'm always looking for. How are the learners being asked to create or produce something and making sense of the content with their hands and their hearts and their heads? And Susie, mentioned this. I haven't worked on any of the school closures, but certainly thinking about how can people contribute, how can people participate in the creation of a new space, and all of those different levers of design are important, definitely within both youth learning environments and adult learning environments. A really strong contributing factor to people seeming like they have a sense of belonging is asking them for their feedback and then using that feedback to iterate on your design. It makes a better product, and people feel like and they know that you're listening to them and you care about what their needs are. So definitely, as these new schools are coming into focus, do students and parents have a voice, and are they able to contribute to the design of these new systems is really key and critical. And that takes a lot of groundwork and a lot of listening. And sometimes the resources haven't been put forth for that to happen.
Christine, I'm going to ask you the same question. In your experience, what does it take to design spaces or systems that move beyond static inclusion and into fostering an active relational belonging?
Oh, that's such a great question. I think that process of, setting the norms and then putting the norms into practice is a really important thing. And in my work, I really seek out key partnerships where the organization that I partner with really understands that relationships are at the center of what I want to do. So a lot of the art world is object-centered, and I'm really trying to make my work human-centered. And a lot of funding agencies are deliverable-centered, and I work really hard to find partners who understand that if there's a relationship at stake that requires us to pull the brakes a little bit or to pivot, that we can push back on those kind of pressures of productivity or deliverables, and make this space to take the time take as much time as it needs, because it's like the process is more important to me than the product.
And Susie, you wrote in our chat box, the move from transactional to relational is critical. Can you speak a little bit more to what that comment means?
Sure. I'm always trying to think about, you know, if belonging is our goal, what are some of the from tos? And so just echoing what Christine was saying there about the importance, well, and everyone in different ways, of the relational, that's critical to belonging. And so many of our systems are set up to be transactional. And our ability to kind of hold on to that notion of they don't necessarily have to be that transactional, they could be more relational. And remembering kind of from the design lens that everything that has been redesigned, that has been designed, can in fact be redesigned. So if we hold that principle of how could we make this meeting, this party, this school redesign process more relational, that can help us do work that then actually turns out to be, in fact, more relational.
I'll just echo that. You know, the subtitle of my book is about the move from the transactional to the relational, or the transformational. And I see that difference as in some ways being caught up in predictability. Like if it's transactional, I'm putting something in because I know exactly what I'm going to get out. And I want a set of controls in place. I want to be able to understand exactly what's going to happen. If I'm being relational, then I embrace not knowing what's going to happen. I embrace maybe a set of values. I maybe embrace a process that I trust. But I want to be changed the process so that I don't know where I'm going to be at the end. And I think that ability to release the need to know the outcome, to release control, to trust in the people I'm in community with is so critical and so needed, and something that so many of our institutions just have forgotten how to do. Though I think for much of human history, many of our institutions did know how to do that.
We are at 6:45, and so I do have to do my closing. But thank you so much for our incredible panelists, David J., Brooke Toczylowski, Susie Wise, and Christine Wong Yap, for their profound insights and reflections today. Your practice and continued inquiry reminds us that design is not about seeking definitive answers, but also about asking these living questions that call us to reiterate, adapt, and transform alongside our ever-changing world. Your work inspires us to reimagine belonging in ways that are both personal and collective. Before we transition into our optional informal discussion, I would like to remind everyone that our next deep dive into design discussion group will take place on January 29th, 2025. We'll explore the central question, how might we create a more just and equitable future? The introductory roundtable will feature 3 incredible thought leaders. We will have Aida Miriam Davis, who is the author of Kindred Creation. We will have Quinlan Messenger, who is the founder of Just Design, and Leslie Ann Noel, who is the author of Design Social Change. And you can register for this exciting gathering starting now. We'd love to see you there, and the link is in the chat box there. And finally, as we close, I do invite everyone to turn on your cameras if you feel comfortable and wave a goodbye to our amazing panelists. Let's send them off with all our gratitude and love for the inspiration that they have shared with us today. And thank you once again for being a part of this wonderful conversation.